When the knock finally came, it did not sound dramatic or rushed. It sounded controlled, practiced, and timed for a moment of maximum advantage. In Ruislip, a quiet suburb just outside London, a small bungalow sat unnoticed. It looked like the kind of place where routines stay the same for years. Neighbors pass by, lights turn on and off, and no one asks questions. That morning, the investigators were not chasing a rumor or a single document. They were chasing a pattern that had started to feel too consistent. They stepped inside with the mindset of people who expect deception, not the messy kind of deception that leaves obvious fingerprints, the careful kind that survives because it looks ordinary. Inside, the first minutes felt almost disappointing. A modest home, simple rooms, familiar furniture, nothing that screamed danger. Then the search moved from what was visible to what was deliberately hidden, and the house began to change shape in their minds. They did not find one dramatic item that solved everything instantly. They found small pieces that only made sense when placed together. Storage that did not fit the layout of a normal home. Equipment that belonged more to tradecraft than to a private life. Photographs that felt technical rather than personal. Materials that suggested a process, not a collection. That is the difference between a person who steals and a service that operates. A thief takes what is available and hopes not to be caught. A professional system takes what matters and repeats it without noise. The deeper the investigators looked, the clearer that system became. This bungalow was not simply a hiding place for risky items. It was a working link in a chain designed to move information quietly. At that point, the case was already serious. A relay point is never built for one message on one bad day. A relay point exists because someone expects steady traffic. It exists because someone built procedures, backups, and discipline. It exists because someone planned to keep operating for a long time. But the real shock did not come from equipment or secret storage. The real shock came from the people who lived there. On paper, they were Peter and Helen Kroger. They looked like settled residents with controlled manners and a quiet rhythm. They had the kind of presence that discourages curiosity. They ran a small business and kept their circle limited. Everything about them suggested stability, not risk. Yet the truth was that the Krogers were not who they claimed to be. Their real names were Morris and Lona Cohen. They were not thrill-seekers pretending to play a dangerous role. They were not beginners who made a single careless mistake. They were trained, disciplined, and experienced in covert work. What made that revelation even more unsettling was where they came from. They were American, operating deep inside Britain under false identities. Their story did not begin with London or even with Britain.
It began years earlier, with ideology and a steady commitment to secrecy. It began with a choice that slowly replaced ordinary life with quiet mission. To understand why this raid mattered, the cast must be clear early. This story has many names, and the names are part of the weapon. Morris Cohen and Lona Cohen are the real people at the center. Peter Kroger and Helen Kroger are the identities that protected them in Britain. And then there is another figure who connects their bungalow to bigger damage. In public, that man was Gordon Lonsdale. In reality, he was Conan Melody, a Soviet illegal officer under deep cover. He moved through Britain with the confidence of someone who belonged. At the same time, he helped build a pipeline of classified material. That pipeline did not depend on one lucky break. It depended on structure, discipline, and people who knew their lanes. If you are wondering how a quiet home ties to naval secrets, here is the link. This case was not about a single trader in a single office. It was about a chain where each person handled only one small piece. One person gathered material and believed it was limited. Another person received it and reduced it into a safer form. Another person moved it onward, using methods built for silence. That is how professional intelligence services win time and advantage. They do not need everything to weaken the other side. They need the right details that shift confidence into vulnerability. They need technical edges that reveal what the enemy can detect. They need information that changes planning before the public ever notices. And they need it delivered in fragments that look harmless on their own. Because fragments do not trigger panic until someone assembles them. By the time the full picture appears, the damage is already established. What looks like routine becomes a long story of quiet losses. Now, we already know this bungalow was raided and the cover collapsed, so the most important question is not whether they were caught. The important question is how they lasted as long as they did. How did two Americans become trusted assets for Moscow over many years? How did they cross borders, rebuild identities, and live without slipping? How did they become essential to a network that fed secrets eastward? There is a sharper question under all of that. What was the first mistake that made the watchers look in their direction? Because once counterintelligence commits to watching you, life becomes a countdown. Most people never know when that countdown begins. They only learn it existed when the door finally opens. If you stay with me, we will trace that countdown from the start. We will begin with the kind of conviction that reshapes a life. Then we will follow the links, one by one, with no skipped steps. And by the end, that quiet bungalow will feel less like a surprise. It will feel like an outcome that was building, patiently, in the dark.
To understand how Morris and Lona Cohen ended up in that bungalow, we have to go back to a different America. Not the America of movie posters in bright confidence, but the America where many people felt squeezed. The Great Depression did not just break bank accounts, it broke trust, and it made big ideas feel like life rafts. For Morris Cohen, politics was not an abstract debate. It was something that seemed to offer structure when everything around him looked unstable. He was young, intense, and drawn to communities that promised purpose. In those circles, commitment was admired, and doubt was treated like weakness. If you believed deeply enough, you were not just supporting a cause, you were joining a side of history. That mindset matters because it explains something crucial about this story. Morris did not start as a person looking for easy money. He started as a person who wanted to be part of something bigger than himself. That desire can look noble from the inside. From the outside, it can be the perfect opening for recruitment. His path took him into the Spanish Civil War, where ideology turned into survival. It was not a classroom argument anymore. It was fighting, fear, and the daily pressure of staying alive. He was wounded there, and he came back carrying more than scars. He came back with a hardened identity, shaped by conflict and loyalty. This is the moment where many stories would slow down and soften, where someone returns, starts over, and tries to live normally again. But Morris was not moving toward normal life. He was moving toward deeper commitment, even if he didn't label it that way. That's the kind of personality intelligence services watch for carefully, because a person like that can be guided without needing large payments. They can be guided by belief, and belief is often more reliable than cash. Lona's story runs alongside his, but it has its own gravity. She was not just a passive character who drifted into someone else's world. She was capable, steady, and trusted in the circle she moved within. That matters because long-term covert work demands more than bravery. It demands discipline, patience, and the ability to live with secrecy every day. When Morris and Lona became a couple, it created a structure that Moscow valued. A married pair can look normal in places where single operatives stand out. A couple can travel more naturally and build routine without raising suspicion. A couple can also share risk, which can make them more resilient under pressure. In the logic of tradecraft, this is not romance. This is operational efficiency wearing the mask of domestic life. If you want a simple way to picture it, think of cover as a stage set. A single person has to build that set alone and protect it alone. A couple can reinforce the same story from two angles at once. They can answer questions without pausing. They can create the illusion that life is ordinary because it looks shared. By the time they were considered useful, the work was already moving quietly. Not with dramatic handoffs in dark alleys the way people imagine it, but with routines that looked like errands, social visits, and harmless travel. This is one of the most unsettling truths in counterintelligence. The most dangerous operations often blend into the simplest daily scenes. In the United States during the war years, Soviet intelligence focused intensely on information, not just political information, but industrial and scientific advantage. War accelerates technology, and technology changes power. So the goal was not to steal everything.
The goal was to steal what could close a gap faster than normal development. This is where Lona's role became especially important. She was used as a courier, moving information between people who should not meet. Courier work sounds simple until you understand what it really demands. You carry material that cannot be explained, and you cannot show fear. You must look normal while your mind measures every glance around you. You must remember details without writing them down, and you must accept that if anything goes wrong, you are on your own. The story often connects Lona to the Manhattan Project network through Theodore Paul. That part matters because it shows the scale of what Moscow was chasing. It also shows how intelligence work is often built from small human choices. A young scientist thinks they are balancing power. A courier thinks they are delivering a message that matters. A handler thinks they are managing a source. And somewhere far away, a service builds a long-term advantage from the sum. The more Lona proved reliable, the more valuable she became. Reliability is the currency that matters most in covert work. Not charm, not bravery, not even intelligence by itself. Reliability means you show up, you stay calm, and you do not improvise. It means you do the boring parts correctly, again and again for years. Morris, in parallel, grew deeper into the same world. By now, their lives were no longer built around ordinary goals. They were built around access, contacts, and staying useful. And once you become useful to a service like that, the work rarely ends on its own. It ends because you are compromised or because the political winds change. Sometimes both arrive at the same time. After the war, the atmosphere in the United States shifted sharply. Security tightened, investigations expanded, and suspicion spread through workplaces. The space to operate narrowed, and networks that had been tolerated quietly became targets. For people connected to covert activity, the pressure was no longer theoretical. It became a daily calculation, and every day carried a question. Are we still invisible, or are we already being counted down? For Morris and Lona, the answer eventually became clear enough to act on. They did not wait for handcuffs to appear in the doorway.
They moved before the system fully closed around them. In 1950, they left the United States and disappeared into the wider world. That departure is one of the most important turning points in this story, because it is the moment they stop being a domestic asset network. They start becoming something more rare and more dangerous. They start becoming illegals, the kind of operatives built to live under a false life, not for weeks, not for months, but for years at a time. Leaving is one thing, but rebuilding is another. It is easy to change a name on paper. It is hard to change the texture of a life. A deep cover identity has to feel real in 1,000 tiny ways. Habits, accents, opinions, background details, even the way you hesitate. All of it must line up, especially under casual questioning. This is where their transformation into the Krogers begins, not as a sudden costume change, but as a slow construction process. Training, discipline, and the kind of patience most people never practice. They were not preparing for a single operation. They were preparing to live inside a fabricated history without cracking. And here is the key link back to that bungalow in Ruslip. A quiet suburban life is not the opposite of espionage. For an illegal, it is the ideal operating environment, a place where routine is respected, privacy is normal, and curiosity is considered rude. A place where you can be seen every day and still never be noticed. In the next part, we are going to follow how that cover was built in detail, how a couple becomes Peter and Helen Kroger without leaving rough edges, how they choose a business that supports silence and plausible travel, and how, step by step, they move closer to the network that will later explode as the Portland spy case. Disappearing from the United States was only the first move. The harder move was becoming the kind of people who could stay disappeared. Because in intelligence work, leaving is not the end of pressure. Leaving often means the pressure simply changes shape. If you are being watched at home, you can sometimes sense the heat. You notice the same face twice, the same car twice, the same pause on the phone. But once you step into a new country under a new identity, the danger becomes quieter. It is not the obvious threat of a knock at the door. It is the slow risk of a single inconsistency that can live for years. That is what deep cover really is. It is not a costume and it is not a moment. It is a life that must hold up under ordinary attention. A neighbor asking where you grew up, a shopkeeper asking about your accent, a casual conversation that should feel effortless, Because the moment it stops feeling effortless, someone starts remembering you. For Morris and Lona, the new phase required a full rebuild. Not just new names and paperwork, but a background that sounded natural. A background that explained why they were in Britain.
A background that explained why they could keep to themselves. And a background that explained why they sometimes moved in ways others did not. This is where their choice of cover begins to look almost elegant. They did not pretend to be glamorous business people. They did not choose a role that demanded constant social exposure. They chose something quieter, something that could look ordinary for decades. A small trade, a small business, a life that could be stable on the surface. A rare book business fits that purpose better than most people realize. Books can justify long hours and private routines without raising suspicion. Books can justify travel for sourcing and contacts. Books can justify mail, packaging, and steady communication. Most importantly, books can justify solitude, which is the real shield. In the early years of building this new identity, they would have done what every serious illegal does. They would have memorized a life story until it felt like memory. They would have practiced answers until the answers required no effort. They would have learned how to disagree naturally, how to smile naturally, how to pause naturally. Because even a pause can be suspicious if it arrives in the wrong place. And while they were building that outer life, they were also preparing an inner life. An inner life built on rules that cannot be broken. No unnecessary friendships, no casual confessions, no emotional outbursts that can be repeated later, and no habits that introduce unpredictability. To most people, that would feel like a prison. To a trained couple, it can feel like discipline. And discipline is what keeps a fabricated life from collapsing. It is what turns a cover into something that can survive years of ordinary attention. By the time they were ready to operate in Britain, they were not arriving as strangers. They were arriving as a finished story that could be lived daily. That is why the bungalow in Ruislip mattered so much later. It did not look like a rushed hideout. It looked like a settled life with routines, and routines are convincing. Now, a deep cover couple still needs one more thing to become useful. They need a role inside a larger operation. A couple can live invisibly, but invisibility alone does not move intelligence. They need contacts, tasks, and a network that knows how to use them. This is where the Cold War environment in Britain becomes important. Britain was a central partner in NATO planning, and it was rich in technical research. Not only in weapons, but in the systems that detect, track, and counter weapons. And in the Cold War, technical intelligence can be more valuable than political gossip, because it does not just explain what an enemy believes, it explains what an enemy can do and what they cannot do. Underwater warfare was one of those critical areas. Submarines were becoming more capable, more silent, and more strategic. Detection systems and countermeasures were a constant race. If one side learns the other side's vulnerabilities, the balance shifts quietly. It shifts before the headlines, and often before commanders even admit it. That is the kind of environment that attracts professional intelligence services, not because there is one perfect secret to steal, but because there are thousands of small technical details that add up to advantage. If you can collect those details steadily, you do not need a single dramatic heist. You build a long-term edge that feels like progress on your side and confusion on theirs. At the center of the later network stood a man who looked unusually confident. He looked like someone who enjoyed his own story. In public, he was Gordon Lonsdale, a businessman with charm and momentum. In reality, he was Conan Malovi, operating under deep cover. He was the kind of officer who could recruit, coordinate, and keep the machine moving. And what a machine like that needs is not only sources, it needs processing, transmission, and safe handling. Sources are messy and risky because sources exist in the real world of offices and rules. Sources get nervous, sources make mistakes, sources talk too much. So the operation needs people who can take material and make it safer, people who can reduce it, disguise it, and move it onward without drama. This is where Morris and Lona became perfect. A couple under deep cover can provide stability in the middle of chaos. They can receive material without drawing attention. They can process it with patience and routine. They can operate in short bursts, then return to normal life immediately. They can be the kind of link that never looks like a link. The methods used in those years were built around one central principle. Information should become smaller as it moves. Smaller means easier to hide. Smaller means easier to transport. Smaller means harder to detect during routine searches. And smaller also means that a single loss does not expose everything. This is why the investigators later found tools that did not belong in a normal home. Not because the couple wanted souvenirs, because a relay point is built for repetition. The same tasks performed quietly, with the same discipline, again and again. A relay point does not exist for drama. It exists because the operation expects time. If the story stopped here, it would still be a successful covert life. A couple disappears, rebuilds, settles into Britain, and becomes useful. But the Cold War does not reward stability without consequence. The larger the flow, the greater the chance that something leaks, not always from the spies, but from the environment around them. Because networks rarely collapse from one mistake at the top, they collapse from small fractures at the edges. A source who feels underpaid, a colleague who notices unusual routine, a security officer who suddenly takes procedures seriously, a single defector who carries a list of patterns and names in memory.
And once those fractures appear, counterintelligence begins doing what it does best. It starts collecting quiet signals. It starts tracking small consistencies. It starts building a case that looks slow from the outside. Then, suddenly, it becomes fast. That is the feeling you should hold on to as we move forward, because the Krogers did not wake up one day and realize they were finished. People under deep cover rarely get that luxury. They continue their routines, believing discipline will protect them. Meanwhile, unseen hands begin tightening a net one thread at a time. In the next part, we will step into the heart of the Portland pipeline. We will follow how the material moved from a restricted workplace into the network. We will see why certain technical details mattered so much, and we will track the early signals that made MI5 stop treating this as noise. Because once MI5 starts treating you as a real target, time becomes your enemy. The Portland pipeline did not begin with a genius plan. It began the way many damaging cases begin, with ordinary weakness inside an ordinary system. A workplace that handled sensitive material, people who felt overlooked, underpaid, or bored. Rules that existed on paper, but softened in daily life. At the Admiralty Research Site in Portland, technical work was moving fast. Underwater warfare was not a headline topic, but it was a strategic one. Detection systems, countermeasures, and equipment performance were constantly evolving. The kind of information produced there did not look dramatic to outsiders. To an intelligence service, it could be a shortcut through years of trial and error. Inside that environment were two people who became critical links. Harry Houghton had access and enough familiarity to know where gaps existed. Ethel G. worked close enough to the flow of material to make access possible. Their choices did not need to be heroic or cinematic to be damaging. They only needed to be consistent, because consistency creates volume. In a well-run system, volume triggers alarms. In a system where routines have relaxed, volume can hide in plain sight. Documents become papers. Papers become just another stack, and just another stack becomes the kind of habit that no one challenges. This is where Conan Malady, under the name Gordon Lonsdale, becomes essential. He did not need to break into a facility himself. He did not need to steal anything with his own hands. He needed to recruit, manage, and keep people calm. He needed to make the exchange feel normal enough to repeat. And that was his real skill. Not theatrics, not intimidation, but the steady shaping of confidence. He presented himself as a successful businessman. He carried the social ease of someone who belongs wherever he stands. That ease is powerful because it lowers the defenses of people around him. If you want to understand how espionage works in practice, look at that dynamic.
A source rarely thinks they are selling the future of national security. A source often thinks they are making a deal, solving a personal problem, or taking control. The handler's job is to keep the source thinking that way. Keep it small in their mind, keep it practical, and keep it repeatable. Once the material started moving, the next challenge was not access. The next challenge was handling and transmission without exposing the chain. That is where the Krogers became more than background characters. They were not there to charm sources in pubs or walk in and out of offices. They were there to make the operation cleaner, quieter, and harder to trace. Their home life, their business, and their suburban routine created a shield. A quiet couple in a quiet place does not attract the same attention as a flashy contact. They could receive material, reduce its footprint, and keep the process disciplined. They could also act as a stable link when other links were emotional and unpredictable. This is the part of the story that feels almost unfair, because nothing about it looks dramatic from the outside. A visit looks like a visit. A meeting looks like a meeting. A package looks like a package. The danger is not in any single moment. The danger is in the pattern that builds quietly across months and years. And patterns always create one unavoidable problem. The more often you repeat them, the more likely someone notices. Maybe not a neighbor and not a random stranger, but a service whose entire job is to notice what ordinary people ignore. What usually brings that attention is not one perfect clue. It is a convergence of small signals that start lining up. Unusual contact patterns, movements that look slightly too regular, a lifestyle that does not match visible income, and a name that appears in one place then reappears elsewhere. Then something shifts and the case becomes sharper. In this story, one of the most powerful shifts came from outside Britain. A defector provided information that helped point investigators toward a network. Not every detail was handed over like a neat map, but enough was given to turn vague suspicion into focused attention. Once counterintelligence becomes focused, the atmosphere changes. Surveillance stops being a broad net and becomes a quiet pursuit. Days are watched without action. Meetings are observed without interruption. The goal is not to catch one person doing one thing. The goal is to identify the whole chain, then take it apart at once. That is what makes the Portland case feel so tense in hindsight, because for a long time, the people inside it likely felt safe. They had done the same routines many times without consequence. They believed their discipline was enough. They believed their cover was strong. They believed that normal life could keep absorbing risk. But once a service like MI5 begins building a case, time stops being neutral.
Time becomes evidence, and every repeated action becomes another line in a file. Every familiar routine becomes a measurable pattern, and the people being watched rarely realize how much has already been recorded. The Krogers, in particular, benefited from how ordinary they looked. That same ordinariness also made them valuable targets once suspicion formed. A relay point is worth far more than a single courier, because a relay point can connect you to everyone else in the chain. So the pressure began tightening, not loudly but steadily. Investigators do not rush when rushing would warn the network. They wait until they can move in one coordinated wave. They wait until they believe they understand who is who and who connects to whom. And they wait until the evidence is strong enough to survive court and public scrutiny. In the next part, we are going to follow that tightening in a way that feels like a countdown. How surveillance builds from observation into action. How small inconsistencies begin to matter more than dramatic moments. And how a quiet bungalow in Ruislip becomes the place where the whole operation finally collapses. Because by the time the raid happens, the raid is not a beginning. It is the last page of a file that has been growing for a long time. Once MI5 decided this was not noise, the case changed texture. It stopped being a collection of suspicions and became a structured hunt. In counterintelligence, the most dangerous moment is not the raid. The most dangerous moment is the quiet phase before the raid. That is when you are still living normally while someone else is measuring you. Surveillance is not only watching a person walk down a street, it is watching patterns until patterns become predictable. Who you meet, how often, and how those meetings change over time. Which routes you prefer, and when you suddenly change them. How you react when you think nobody is paying attention. At first, the people inside the network likely felt nothing. A careful operation often feels invisible when it is still working. A source tells themselves it is under control. A handler tells themselves the chain is compartmented. A relay point tells itself routine is protection. But routine can also be a trap. Routine creates repetition, and repetition creates a shape. Once the shape exists, a service that specializes in shapes can follow it. The goal is not to catch a single handoff. The goal is to understand the whole machine without tipping it off. That is why MI5 would have been patient. They needed to see where the material moved. They needed to see who the contacts were and how they connected. They needed to know whether the Krogers were the center or only a conduit. And they needed proof that could survive public challenge, not just private certainty. This is where the story becomes a countdown, because the moment surveillance begins, every day adds weight to a file. A meeting becomes a line of observation.
A package becomes a question that demands an answer. A quiet visit becomes a connection that can be mapped. And while the net tightens, the people being watched keep living. They go through errands, polite conversations, and familiar routines. They continue because stopping would look suspicious. They continue because their discipline tells them not to change suddenly. They continue because the work still feels normal from the inside. One of the most effective tools in an investigation like this is time. Time allows you to see what is consistent and what is staged. A staged pattern usually appears only when pressure is felt. A natural pattern appears whether pressure is felt or not. That difference is subtle, but it is everything to a watcher. The other powerful tool is the chain itself. A chain is strong when each link believes it is isolated. A chain becomes fragile when a watcher identifies the joints. Those joints are not always the loudest people. Often they are the quietest, because quiet links carry the most function. That is why the Krogers mattered so much. They did not need to be seen frequently to be important. They needed to be reliable, because reliability is what makes the flow possible. If they processed material, reduced it, and moved it onward, they were central. If they provided communications capability, they were essential. Either way, watching them could reveal more than watching a source alone. As MI5 gathered more, the case likely moved toward verification. Verification is the moment you stop asking, is something happening? You start asking, who exactly are these people? And that question is more dangerous than it sounds, because aliases are meant to survive casual attention, not deep inspection. Deep inspection looks for what never changes. Paper histories can be built, stories can be memorized, but biology and past records have a way of resurfacing. A single match can collapse years of careful construction. At some point, investigators reached the kind of confidence that triggers action, not because they wanted drama, but because they needed closure. They needed to seize equipment before it could be removed. They needed to stop transmissions before evidence vanished. They needed to arrest multiple links before anyone could warn the others. That is why takedowns tend to happen in coordinated waves. If you arrest one person too early, the rest scatter. If you move too slowly, the network adapts. The timing has to be strict, and the decisions have to be final. Now think back to the bungalow again and what it represented. It was quiet, which is exactly why it was dangerous. It was stable, which is exactly why it was valuable. A stable relay point means the operation is not improvising. It means the operation expects to continue. It means someone built a workflow, not a one-time trick. So when the raid finally comes, it is not sudden from MI5's perspective. It is the moment when enough threads have been gathered to pull hard. It is the moment when the watchers stop collecting and start closing. It is the moment when the network learns that time has run out. And even then, the raid is only the beginning of the final phase, because arresting people is one step, explaining what they did, proving how they did it, and showing the chain is another. Trials are where covert work gets translated into public language. That translation is difficult because it must be precise and persuasive. It must be clear enough for a courtroom and strong enough to withstand doubt. In the next part, we will move through the collapse itself in a tight sequence. We will follow how the arrests connected the network in public view. We will see how the identities were exposed beyond reasonable denial, and we will follow what happened after when the Cold War logic reappeared. Because even when a network is broken, the story does not end cleanly. It shifts into consequences, reforms, embarrassment, and the quiet fear of what else might exist. And it shifts into the Cold War's most cynical truth. Sometimes, even after you are caught, the game still continues. By the time the arrests came, the outcome had already been decided in files. The only thing left was execution, and execution in cases like this must be synchronized. A network does not fall link by link when counterintelligence can help it. It falls in one coordinated wave before anyone inside it can adapt. When MI5 moved, they moved with purpose. not only to detain people, but to secure evidence before it could disappear. In an operation built around concealment, minutes can matter more than hours. A single hidden compartment emptied at the wrong time can erase a full story. So the timing was built to deny the network its last advantage, which is warning. The bungalow in Ruislip was the place where the story became visible, not because the home looked unusual, but because what was inside had a different logic. Normal homes carry personal clutter, ordinary paperwork, in familiar patterns. This home carried signs of repetition, method, and an invisible workflow, the kind of items that only make sense when you assume professional tradecraft. For investigators, that discovery would have done two things at once. It would have confirmed function, and it would have sharpened identity. Function is what the house was doing for the network. Identity is who these people truly were beneath the names on their mail. And identity is where the case became impossible to dismiss. A cover can survive casual questions for a long time. It struggles when every detail is cross-checked against records and histories, when a name is tested, and the past begins to answer in ways the cover cannot. At that point, denial becomes less a defense and more a delay. The arrests of the other links completed the picture. A handler under deep cover, presenting as a businessman.
A source inside a sensitive facility, moving material outward. A second insider who made access easier, whether through trust or proximity. A relay couple who processed, reduced, and enabled communication. Different roles, different risks, one shared outcome. What makes this phase feel so tense is that it is not cinematic from the inside. There are no speeches, and there is no moment where everyone admits everything. There is confusion, sudden silence, and the shock of routines breaking. And there is the unsettling realization that ordinary life can collapse in one morning. Then comes the part most viewers never fully consider. After arrests, the real work often begins. Evidence has to be cataloged, methods explained, and chains proven. Counterintelligence must show not just what was found, but what it meant. In court, meaning matters as much as objects. This is where many spy stories lose momentum because trials can feel procedural. But this trial had something the public could grasp immediately. It had false identities that collapsed in front of ordinary people. It had a respectable couple whose real lives were something else entirely. It had a charming businessman who was not what he claimed to be. And it had a clear strategic theme because the stolen material was not random. When technical intelligence is involved, clarity becomes a battle. You cannot simply say, "they took secrets," and expect the weight to land. You have to show why those secrets mattered in terms people understand. Not every listener needs the full engineering detail. They need the consequence, and they need the scale. The scale, in this case, lived in the quiet word advantage. Underwater warfare is a contest of detection and silence. If one side learns the other side's capabilities and limitations, planning changes, training changes, procurement changes, and confidence changes. Sometimes, strategy changes without anyone publicly explaining why. That is the kind of damage that rarely looks dramatic on the day it happens. It looks like paperwork and drawings and technical notes moving into the wrong hands. Years later, it looks like the other side closing gaps too quickly. It looks like a race where someone seems to know the track ahead of time. The convictions, in the end, were the public seal on what MI5 had built privately. They were also a signal to every other network that Britain was watching more closely. A successful takedown creates deterrence, but it also creates fear, because the obvious question becomes unavoidable. If this happened here, how many more quiet links exist elsewhere? For Morris and Lona, the aftermath was not a clean moral ending. It rarely is in intelligence history. Prison time is one chapter, but the Cold War always keeps a door open, because states treat people like assets even after they are exposed, especially if those people have value for exchange. And this is where the story shifts from counterintelligence to geopolitics.
When the right moment arrives, prisoners can become bargaining chips. A spy can be traded for another spy, or for a defector, or for leverage. The courtroom closes one narrative, but the state opens another, and the people inside it become pieces in a larger negotiation. In the next part, we will finish the story through two lenses at once. First, what happened to the key figures after conviction and exposure. Second, what the case changed inside Britain's security culture and why it mattered. Because the Portland case was not only about a network being broken, it was about a country being reminded that quiet life can hide quiet war. After the convictions, Britain could finally say the network was broken. But in the Cold War, broken rarely means finished. A network can be dismantled while the logic behind it stays alive. And that logic always returns to one question: what is a prisoner worth? Canon Melody, the man Britain had known as Gordon Lonsdale, did not vanish into silence. His value was too high for silence to be the end of the story. In April 1964, he was exchanged in Berlin for Greville Wynne. That moment carried an unspoken message that everyone understood. Even when a case looks closed in court, states still keep negotiating behind the curtain. For Morris and Lona, the timeline stretched longer, but the outcome followed the same Cold War pattern. They had been sentenced heavily because the court treated them as core operators, yet they did not serve those sentences to the end. In 1969, Britain arranged a prisoner exchange that included the Cohens. They were traded for Gerald Brooke, a British subject held in the Soviet Union. The swap was criticized by some in Britain because it looked uneven, but criticism does not erase the reality of how these games are played. Governments weigh pressure, optics, and leverage, then they choose a move. The last links did not remain behind bars forever either. Harry Houghton and Ethel G. were released early in 1970. That detail matters because it shows a final contrast in this story. The insiders who started the leak served time, but the machine around them was already gone. The professionals, the ones built for long operations, became exchange material, and the operation's true cost was absorbed by institutions that had to admit they were vulnerable. Once Morris and Lona reached Moscow, the story did not turn into retirement. It turned into a different kind of service. They lived openly there, but they still lived as people defined by clandestine work. Accounts describe them training others, passing on methods and discipline. In that world, their survival and their exchange were treated like proof of value. They were not framed as a failed mission. They were framed as an operation that delivered enough to be honored. For Britain, the Portland case became a harsh lesson in one sentence: a sophisticated breach does not always look like a sophisticated breach.
Sometimes it looks like routine becoming lazy. It looks like documents handled too casually. It looks like small exceptions that grow into a culture. It looks like people thinking the rules are for someone else. And that is the part that stays relevant long after the Cold War headlines fade, because the most dangerous threats inside secure systems are often not dramatic. They are slow, human, and predictable. They grow where oversight relaxes and where convenience becomes normal. Then one day, the damage appears, and everyone asks how it happened. The uncomfortable answer is that it happened in plain sight for a long time. So when you look back at that bungalow in Ruislip, it stops feeling like a twist. It starts feeling like the final frame of a long, quiet process, a process built from ideology, patience, and professional method, a process that did not need explosions or chaos to do harm. It only needed time, repetition, and silence. And maybe that is the most unsettling truth of all. The Cold War was not only fought in speeches and crises, it was fought in ordinary streets, quiet homes, and routines that looked harmless. It was fought by people who understood that secrecy is not an event. Secrecy is a lifestyle, maintained one calm day at a time. In stories like this, people often want one clean lesson that ties everything together. They want a simple warning, a simple villain, and a simple ending that feels satisfying. But the Portland case never really offers that kind of comfort. It offers something colder, and in many ways more realistic. Because Morris and Lona Cohen were not reckless criminals chasing excitement. They were disciplined operators who built a life around silence and repetition. They did not rely on chaos, and they did not need dramatic moments to do damage. They relied on routine, on patience, and on the human tendency to stop noticing patterns. That is why their story still lands with weight today. It shows how a secret operation can live inside ordinary life without disturbing it. A quiet street can hide a quiet relay point. A modest home can hold a workflow designed for long-term extraction. A couple that looks stable can be stable for a reason that has nothing to do with peace. And if you rewind to the beginning, the most revealing detail is the simplest one. The raid did not happen because someone suddenly got lucky. It happened because counterintelligence learned how to listen to small signals.
It learned how to watch time, not just moments. It learned how to treat routine as evidence when routine became too consistent to ignore. In the Cold War, that was the real battlefield. Not only the battlefield of weapons, but the battlefield of attention. One side tried to collect fragments without being seen. The other side tried to notice shapes before the fragments became advantage. When you look at it that way, the case stops being only a spy story.
It becomes a story about how systems fail slowly and how they recover slowly. There is also a human edge that is easy to miss if we focus only on tradecraft. Living under deep cover is not only dangerous because of arrest, it is dangerous because it requires constant self-control. It requires you to keep your emotions small, your friendships limited, and your life predictable. It asks you to turn your identity into an instrument that never show the strain. For Morris and Lona, that strain was not an accident. It was part of what they accepted when they chose this path. Their loyalty may have felt like a cause to them. To the countries they targeted, it looked like betrayal in its most methodical form. Both perspectives existed at the same time, and that tension is part of the truth. If there is one image that sums it up, it is that bungalow in Ruslip. Not because it looked scary, and not because it looked like a fortress, because it looked forgettable, and forgettable is often the point. A safe operation does not stand out. A safe operation makes itself blend into the background of everyone else's life. That is why the end of this case does not feel like a dramatic finish. The arrests were a climax, but they were also a reminder. A network can be removed, but the method can be repeated. The names change, the covers change, the technology evolves, and the logic stays familiar. Somebody is always trying to move information quietly. Somebody is always trying to spot the pattern before it becomes too late. And that leaves us with the question that matters more than any single name. How many other quiet places, in other quiet towns, once played the same role? How many operations did not collapse because their routines never created a visible shape? How many cases were never written into the public record because the chain was never found? Those questions are not meant to create panic. They are meant to show what this era really was beneath the speeches and headlines. A cold contest of patience, precision, and human weakness. So when people call this story a spy scandal, that is true in one sense, but it is also a story about how easy it is for a system to get comfortable, how easy it is for rules to soften into habits, how easy it is for just this once to become a rhythm that lasts years, and how hard it is to detect damage when damage arrives as fragments. In the end, the Cohens did what many deep cover operators are trained to do. They built a life that could carry an operation without drawing attention. They stayed consistent until they could not. Then the state treated them the way the Cold War often treats exposed assets, not as a moral lesson, but as pieces in a larger negotiation. And the world moved on, as it always does. But the file remained, and the lesson remained, not as a slogan, but as a warning written in quiet details. If you want to understand how intelligence history really works, look at the quiet parts. Look at the routine, the discipline, and the small human decisions that become a pipeline. Look at the ordinary life that can hide extraordinary intent. If you enjoyed this kind of Cold War story, you will find more on this channel. We focus on cases where hidden history shaped the world in ways people rarely notice. So if you want the next file, the next network, and the next quiet operation, stay with us. Subscribe and tell me in the comments which case you want uncovered next. Because some stories do not end when the courtroom closes. They end when we finally see how they worked. The final phase did not begin with shouting or chaos. It began with coordination, timing, and a decision that the net was ready. When a counterintelligence service moves on a network, it is rarely impulsive. It moves when it believes the evidence can survive daylight. It moves when it believes arrests can happen without warning spreading. It moves when it believes the relay point can be secured before it can be cleaned. That is why the raid on the bungalow mattered more than its quiet appearance. A relay point is where the operation becomes physical. It is where equipment sits, where processes repeat, and where mistakes accumulate slowly. If you can seize that point, you can turn suspicion into certainty. The moment the investigators entered, the mission was not only detention, the mission was control of the environment. Every room, every storage area, every hidden space had to be treated as evidence, because the most dangerous thing in a case like this is loss of context. An object alone can be dismissed, but a system cannot. What they found, in essence, was proof of function, proof that this was not an ordinary household routine, proof that information could be handled, reduced, and moved onward quietly. It was the kind of proof that does not rely on one dramatic item. It relies on many items that point in the same direction. And then identity followed function, because identity was the real fortress. Peter and Helen Kroger were names built to survive casual contact. They were not built to survive deep verification. Once records, travel histories, and long-range checks began answering back, the story tightened. It became harder and harder to explain how this couple had arrived here as who they claimed to be. At the same time, other arrests completed the circle. The handler, who had operated as Gordon Lonsdale, was pulled into the open. The insiders tied to the flow of material were brought in as well. This is what a synchronized takedown is meant to achieve. No one is left free to warn the others. No one is left free to reshape the narrative when evidence is still being gathered. From the outside, these moves can look sudden. From the inside, they are usually the result of long, quiet observation. They are the moment when the watchers stop collecting and start closing. And once they close, the network's greatest strength becomes its weakness.
Compartmentation protects you when only one link is caught. Compartmentation collapses you when the state takes many links at once. Because each link, under pressure, becomes a map of habits. And habits, when lined up, can reveal the full structure. Now the case had reached the point of no return. It was no longer a question of whether something had happened. It was a question of how to explain it clearly enough to prove it publicly. That is where the next phase begins, and it is more brutal than a raid. It is the courtroom phase, where secrecy has to be translated into language. Trials are where spy stories become uncomfortable because they become specific. A court does not accept atmosphere or suspicion. It demands timelines, connections, and evidence that can be tested. It demands explanations that make sense to ordinary people, and it demands that a cover identity fails in a way the public can understand. That is why this case landed so hard. It didn't rely on one dramatic confession to shock the public. It relied on a chain of proof that made denial feel thinner with each step. The public didn't need to understand every technical detail to feel the weight. They only needed to understand that technical detail changes advantage, and advantage in underwater warfare can decide outcomes before anyone notices. The convictions closed one chapter, but the Cold War rarely lets stories end cleanly. States keep thinking in terms of leverage. They keep calculating what a prisoner is worth and what a trade can achieve. That is why the aftermath did not stay inside Britain's prison walls. In April 1964, Conan Molody, the man known in Britain as Gordon Lonsdale, was exchanged in Berlin. He was traded for Greville Wynne, and the swap carried a clear message. In this world, even a convicted illegal can remain valuable if the timing is right. For Morris and Lona, the clock ran longer, but the logic stayed the same. They had been treated as core operators, and their sentences reflected that. Yet in 1969, they were included in a prisoner exchange and returned to the Soviet Union. The details of who is traded for whom can be argued in public forever. The deeper truth is that both sides understood the same equation. People become bargaining chips when states decide the cost is acceptable. Even the insiders tied to the Portland flow did not remain in prison forever. In 1970, Harry Houghton and Ethel G. were released early. By then, the network that had made their actions so consequential was already history. The damage had already been absorbed, analyzed, and used as a warning internally. And that is where the real legacy begins. Britain did not only punish individuals. It had to confront how ordinary weakness can become strategic exposure, how routine can soften rules into habit, how a secure workplace can begin treating sensitive material like paperwork, and how a quiet couple in a quiet suburb can become a relay for something far larger.
When you look back at that bungalow in Ruislip, the twist becomes less important than the method.
The method is what makes the story feel modern, even decades later. A professional operation does not need chaos to do harm. It needs patience, repetition, and the human tendency to relax once nothing goes wrong. This is why the ending is not really an ending. The network fell, but the idea behind it survived. Someone is always trying to move information quietly. Someone is always trying to spot the pattern before it becomes too late. And the contest is rarely loud enough for the public to feel it happening. So if you want the clearest lesson from this case, it is not a slogan. It is a reminder written in quiet details. Watch the routines, not the drama. Watch the small exceptions, not the official rules. Watch the places that look forgettable, because forgettable is often the point. If you enjoyed this Cold War file, you will find more stories like it here. We focus on hidden networks, deep cover, and the cases that shaped strategy in silence. So subscribe and tell me which case you want uncovered next. Because the most important stories are often the ones that lived quietly until they didn't.